Hello, and welcome back to another set of podcasts. This is Dr. Kim Pope-Seiberling, and I'm here today to talk to you about signage. This is the first of 3 podcasts on signage, and I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking, what on earth is she going to talk about for 3 podcasts about signage? Isn't it as easy as running something off on your printer and sticking it somewhere? And my answer to you is that there is an art to signage and that churches need to recognize the importance of signage. The art of finding your place from point A to point B is actually an ancient tradition. My husband and I used to live in Hawaii on the island of Oahu, and while we were there, we learned a lot about Hawaiian history. And when Cook discovered the Hawaiian Isles and that area of Polynesia, he was amazed at the way that the Hawaiian people could navigate up and down the Hawaiian island chain. See, Cook looked at these people and thought they are not as sophisticated. How are they finding their way? Nautical navigation was extremely complicated back then, and he did not know how the Hawaiians were navigating up and down the Hawaiian sea chain. As it turns out, if you've seen the Disney movie Moana, you know that there were a group of men and women called wayfarers, and they used the stars and other heavenly bodies to tell them where they were and how to get where they were going. They were experts in helping people find their way. Well, I want you to become a wayfarer in your church. I want you to be able to tell the people who come into your church how to get from where they are to where they're trying to go. So, good signage is a part of guest readiness. We don't think necessarily of signage as being something that we need to get in order before we're ready for guests, but it really is. If you are in your own home, you already know how to get to the bathrooms, how to get yourself a glass of water. But when you have a guest stay overnight in your house, you have to show them where those things are. Just like having a guest in your home for the first time and having to show them around, when guests come to our church, we need to be able to help them get around. Now, we live in a society that values independence. Let's face it, we don't like to ask for directions, and when we put our guests in a position of having to ask for help, having to ask for directions, it can make them feel insecure or like they don't know what they're doing. And we do not want our guests feeling like there's something that the people who come here regularly know that I don't know. The people who come here are like, oh, well, everybody knows where that is. But a new guest or someone new to your church doesn't know where that is. And so the more we can make the guest feel like they are part of the church as a whole, the more successful we're going to be in attracting that guest back to our church. So I wanted to go over with you today just some basics that apply to interior and exterior signage. And so I want to talk to you about some things to remember as you're planning your church signage. And the first thing is that good signage is easily visible. Good signage is easily visible. I have been in churches that have signage, but you can't find it. You can't see it. Signage is only as good as it is visible. If we look at this picture here, we see that this signage is actually very effective if we cleared the brush away. I've been at many a church that allow bushes and trees to overrun signage. We have paid a lot. We have invested in our signage. It's important that we keep those areas clear. Exteriorly, we're talking about trees and bush. Interiorly, we're talking about things people might sit in front of signage or other clutter that might distract from the signage. So the number one rule is that signage should be easily visible. For interior signage, generally speaking, this means that signage, such as signage that you would put beside a door or outside a restroom, should be at approximately eye level. Hanging things too high or too low make them hard to see. Our eyes work, generally speaking, horizontally. They don't necessarily go up and down unless we intentionally are looking up and down for something. But when we scan something, we generally scan from left to right horizontally. We're trained that way because that's how we learn how to read. The second thing good signage should be is accurate. Now I know we're all laughing. The sign says keep right and the arrow points left. This is obviously an extreme example. However, if you went into your church today and looked at all the signage, is it completely accurate? So, if your choir room has moved, is that sign that points to where the choir room goes still accurate? If offices have moved, is the signage accurate? Often we think, oh, well, we'll do that later, or oh, well, it doesn't really matter. Well, unfortunately, if you're a first-time guest and your signage is pointing me in the wrong direction, when I find out that you knew about it and you didn't change it, I might be a little frustrated with you. And I might think that you don't care about what it's like to be a first-time guest. So I recommend every year, annually, if not more than annually, that churches go through their building and make sure that their signage, particularly their directional signage, is accurate. So here we're talking about signage literally pointing us to the wrong place. But another form of inaccuracy is misspellings. It's easy to misspell something. I'm the first one to admit that spelling is not my strength. Anyone who knows me can tell you I have never been able to spell. I can tell you I will probably die not knowing how to spell words accurately, but make sure that your signage is spelled accurately. People will notice. The next thing good signage is good signage is clear. So here we have two signs. The one says crosswalk closed, and the other one says sidewalk closed, use crosswalk. So here the pedestrian has no idea what they're supposed to do. Are they supposed to use the crosswalk or are they supposed to use the sidewalk? According to the signage, neither one is an option and you can't go anywhere. So this is not clear signage. I often see unclear signage in the form of arrows that don't make any sense. So I see signage that says go to the right and you look to the right and there's no hallway there. There's nowhere to go. Those rooms are just supposed to be somewhere to the right and it makes no sense whatsoever. So make sure that when you put signage up, that it makes sense to everyone. It will make sense to those of us who know exactly where that room is or exactly where that place is. But does it make sense to someone who doesn't really know, who is new, who is really clueless about where that room might be? It could be anywhere. So clarity is really, really important. Another piece of advice for clarity is not to crowd your signage. I think sometimes we have really, really good intentions. We think we can just put these 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 more rooms on this sign, and that way all the rooms are listed. But what happens is we get crowded signage, and where we're trying to point people to is not clear. My recommendation to churches is that they pick the most important places or the most common places that people would be looking for. So, where are the most common places in the church? They would be your sanctuary, your offices, your children's wing, your youth wing, the fellowship area. Okay, those are the kinds of areas that we want to put on the signage. Other details like the janitor's closet, you might decide isn't a priority for your signage because the signage will become too crowded. This also relates to your sign being readable. If things are too crowded on there, they won't be able to read what's there. So here we have a sign, and I believe that this sign is unreadable. I don't understand this sign, not even a little. Are the women supposed to follow us, whoever us is, on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram? And what about the man? Not even men. The man. Is it pointing to the bathroom? Is it pointing to the women's department? What does always is now mean? I just find this sign super, super confusing. Another theory with signage that I want to remind you of is to think big. A lot of people believe, I know what I'll do. I'll just print out signs out of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and put those up around my church. And while I would commend those people who are attending to their signage, I would suggest to you that 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper aren't really big enough to make an impact in most churches. I want you to think big, especially for exterior signage, because people may be reading that signage 100, 300 feet away from where it is. And the further away you are from that signage, the bigger it needs to be for it to be readable. So for interior signage, what I suggest churches do is that you get big old bolts of craft paper that you cut out the approximate size of the signage that you want to hang up, that you paste it on your walls, and then you experiment a little. How big does that print need to be before you can read it from down the hall? Or how big does that print need to be in order to see where I'm supposed to go when I enter this door or I enter that door? I always feel like that's really helpful to get an idea of what you're actually going to be seeing. And churches are often surprised that the signage is bigger than they would have originally anticipated being. So those are the theories of good signage, but I just want to talk to you really briefly about great signage, because we all have good churches and some of us even have good signage, but I want you to have great signage. So great signage is attractive, it's welcoming and inviting. Okay, so great signage is also an opportunity to communicate your equity. It's a great time if your church has colors that they use in their logo or fonts that are used in your logo to use those in your signage. Great signage is flexible. I always recommend to churches that they have, particularly with indoor signage where rooms do change around frequently, that the frames that you use be flexible, that you be able to easily take out the piece of paper that's inside them and replace them. Uh, frames, signage frames can add up in cost. And so if all you have to do is replace that piece of paper or that insert, that really reduces your cost when you do have to change a couple signs because a room has changed. Finally, great signage is going to stand the test of time. If you put in new signage now, I want you to be able to use that signage for 7 to 10 years, that it should look so good that it will stand the test of time. Briefly, I want to talk about budget. How much exactly are we talking for good quality, professional looking signage? It depends really on the size of your church. I know that sounds like a huge cop out. If you have a small building with just a couple of rooms, you can probably do some very nice interior signage for about $1,000. If you have um, a mid-sized building, you're looking at maybe, excuse me, $2,000 to $5,000 depending on your building. If your building has what I call an obvious layout to it, signage is cheaper. If you have a lot of straight halls, signage is going to be cheaper because we intuitively know to keep on walking down a straight hall. However, if you have one of these buildings that have been built onto and built onto and built onto, and even regular attenders feel like they're in a maze sometimes, your signage budget or your what you're going to want to spend on signage is obviously going to be more, and that might be closer to the $5,000 mark. Exterior signage is less accessible financially speaking. Exterior signage, there's a lot to consider. For example, if you're going to put in exterior signage, it needs to be illuminated at night to be effective. Do you have an electrical line? It's not just the cost of the sign that you're going to put up. So there are a lot of considerations budget-wise for exterior signage. And I would say at the low end, exterior signage, because it does need to be big, and it does need to be durable, and it does need to be weatherproof, can run from $5,000 to $35,000. Very often, those are items that have been bequeathed to the church or come out of a result of a capital campaign. So, budgeting for exterior signage is a more daunting task, but I do know that many churches I know of have saved. It's been a priority to them, and they have been able to put in new exterior signage. Well, I hope I've given you a few things to think about. As far as the signage in your church goes, I encourage you to look around your church building, to look outside your building, and see if there are some of these principles that you might like to apply. Remember, signage is part of guest readiness. It's how we help people feel welcome and give our first time guests confidence and independence so that we can have a better relationship with them. I look forward to seeing you at our next podcast that will feature tips for interior signage. Until then, have a great, blessed day. Bye.